Here we go, here we go. I think I got it.
To make all my Locker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Luss, the Pond Boss, checking in from North Texas. Glad to see you guys this evening. You know the drill. Hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. Click like, share this video to your timeline. You'll be eligible for a drawing for a Pond Boss hat, which I'm running late today, so I don't have one. You know what we're going to do this time? We're going to do a Texas Hunter hat. And a Pond Boss mug that knows how to keep hot things hot and cold things cold. You guys know that. Had a really interesting phone call today from a lady, and I want to share that with you guys. Of course, you know what I do here. I got to figure out what's going on so I can see it on my laptop. So bear with me for a minute. I tell you what I'm going to talk about tonight. I got a phone call today from a lady in Louisiana, a landowner, and her family has been contacted by an oil company to build a lake on their property for them, but to use that water as for fracking in that area. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, and I want to tell you some of the things that I told her today. Plus, bring your questions, and we'll talk about your questions as well. I ran off and left my dadgum charge cord to my laptop, so Debbie's on her way up here with my charge cord. So I'm a little scattered today. Hope you guys aren't as scattered as I am, but we're going to get into some really fun stuff here in just a second. Now I can see it. Yep, here we go. I got it. Look at there. Jason Nepstad, Kim Moore, Jacob West, Travis Smith, Tim Stewart, John Funk. What a wonderful fall week. You know, our colors just started. Our fall colors just started. We've had some leaves come off, but holy cow, I mean, it's pretty dadgum good. Our colors are happening really good. I see Vito and Danny Mack, Chuck Brinkman. So, hey, you know what? The new Pond Boss is out. I haven't even gone through it yet. I've looked at it, you know, in the electronic version, but I haven't had a chance to look at it. But here it is. It's really cool. Got a great cover picture from a Pond Boss subscriber in upstate New York. And it's absolutely beautiful, beautiful fall colors from up there in the Catskills. And what I want to talk to you about today, got a call from a lady in Louisiana, and her question to me was, can you help us design a lake that's going to be built on our property, and we're negotiating that right now. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about it. She said, well, we talked to them a couple of years ago, and they wanted to build a shallow 80-acre lake. But when they figured out all the permits they had to get and how long it would take to get those permits, they changed their minds. So what they want to do is build a smaller lake that's about 35 acres. And I want that lake to end up being a fishing lake that we can also swim in. So I said, how much land have you got? And they've got a substantial amount of land, and it's right on the Texas-Louisiana border. My fear was if they had, 42 acres of land with a 35-acre lake on it, how functional would that be? And I would tell her something different than if she had 2,000 acres with a 35-acre lake in the middle of it. So the question she had was, what's this lake going to be worth? That's one question. Another question is, I don't know anything about lakes, so what do we need to do as we negotiate with this company that all they want is the water? So I said, okay, one thing you need is a time limit. She said, well, we've done that. She said, we've got part of our negotiations is that they would build the lake, and then they could only draw it down so far at one time, and that after a finite period of time, they would not use water from it anymore. And she said they want the negotiation is that they want to use enough water for free to recover the cost of building the dam. So my advice to her there was, find out what it's going to cost to build the dam, because you don't want an open-ended agreement. Well, because they could tell you that's a $2 million dam and you wouldn't know any different, unless they can prove it up. So it just sprung a whole lot of questions that need to be asked. Let's see who we got here. I thought I saw Fred Bingaman. I hope Connie's doing well, and you've sent our love to Connie as she heals from a broken leg. There's Wyatt Coniger checking in from Denver, Colorado, Jeremy Duckworth, Jake Hughes, Jake, good to see you. Kyle Edwards, Billy Birch, Catfish Birch checking in. Christopher Aguilar. Christopher, almost emailed you earlier, but I was traveling and I didn't get to do it. So I think I'll message you on Facebook when I get a few minutes, and we'll talk a little bit, because I had a couple ideas. So anyway, here's what was going on with that lady. So as we chit-chatted, I listened to her tell me the story. And the story is basically, we've got this much land, 35-acre lake. One of my fears is that we'll have so much flow through water that it won't be a good fishing lake. So I started talking her through a little bit of the process. She got a lot of unknowns, which, just like everybody, unless you've built a lake, you don't even know what to ask sometimes. So I'm glad she's asking now instead of when they're about 2 weeks from pulling the equipment off and being finished with it, And so here's where I went. I said, job one is you need them to quantify the value of the dam so you can quantify the value of the water comparatively. So in other words, if that lake was already there, what would they be paying you for your water to use in the fracking process in the oil field? So what's the value of the water? Compare that to the value of the dam. And they need to be straight up with you about the value of the dam. The second thing I said, the process that you and I need to go through is we need to be sure that they're building the right size dam on the right size site. So one of the questions I'll end up asking her is this 35-acre lake site the same as the 80-acre lake site? And if that's the case, and they're going down to that 35-acre lake site size just to keep from having to have certain permits, how does the watershed compare to that? So what we want to do is we want to look at the size of the watershed and compare the size of the watershed to the size that the lake needs to be. Hi, honey. Here comes my lovely wife. Thanks, baby. You don't have to come around and get on camera unless you just want to. She brought me my charge cord, so now my laptop won't die in the next 20 minutes. Thanks, baby. I'll see you in a little bit. She blew me a kiss. I'm going to plug this sucker in. So, as we were talking about that, my head was spinning and her head started to spin a little bit. Let's see here. Who else we got? Kyle Edwards said hello to Kyle. Bill Russell. Bob Mayer. Wesley Ellis. Let me see who else. I'm going to look up here on my phone because I saw some folks I didn't recognize. And is it going to let me? Let's see. Spiro Vasilio. I know I butchered your name. I'm sorry. Glad to see you. Now, so what I was telling her is, with that fear is we can sit down and measure the watershed on topo maps and compare that to the size of the lake and the dam site that they're talking about constructing this lake. Because really all the oil field company wants to do is build a reservoir to store water that they can use when they want to use it. Totally different mission than what her mission is. She wants to have a lake that she can fish in, swim in with the family and grandkids and all that, and have fun. So she wants a recreational fishing lake. So part of her negotiations up front needs to be laying out with those construction folks and the oil field crew as to what her expectations are, and they need to agree to it. So I explained to her, building a dam, it's a structure. It's got to be built properly, cored properly, the right kind of dirt, built in a way where it's compacted properly, where it won't seep, won't leak, and it won't be a nightmare, 5 years down the road. And then the inside of that lake is going to be a living, breathing entity, a body of water that's going to need all the different elements of habitat based on her goals. If she wants a bass fishing lake, we need to have bass fishing habitat. We need to have bluegill habitat. We need to have, all the different forage fish species habitat designed into that lake. Well, that's not something an oil field company is going to know anything about because all they want is water. So job one is quantify the value of the dam or the cost of the dam and compare that to the value of the water or the cost of the water. And let's see what those two things look like. For the oil field business that she wants to transact and that they want to do. And at the same time, what does it take to take this site and turn it into a premier fishing lake? So that's where the decisions are going to start coming in, because they're going to want to spend the least amount of money possible to get the best bang for their buck, to get the water that they want for these wells that they're proposing to drill. And also told her they need to have a timeline. You can't just leave that open-ended. You know, if it's going to be 5 years worth of fracking water, then that's what it is. She did say that once they got recovered the amount of water value to offset the cost of the dam, then they'd start splitting the value of the water with the landowner 50-50. Now, how do you know whether you should take that or not until you know the value of the water? How much is a barrel of water worth? You know, and I don't know, but I'm getting ready to learn. You know, so now we're going to see just exactly how that works. There's Latham Pugh. Good to see Latham. Jeff Wallen, you bet. Hey, glad to have you on board too, buddy. And so what the conversation that we're going to have, I'm going to scroll up here a minute because I don't want to miss any questions. Let's see here. Let's see, Doug Brown. Let's see here. Kirk Savoy and Hunter Magnus. Let's see here. Darlene Blankenship. Rod Clinkscales. We've got some new folks on there. Good to see you guys. Glad y'all are watching tonight. So anyway, as we go through this process, I want her to understand what that process is. Job one is we need to have a really solid understanding as to what the dam is going to be built like. And is it going to meet their expectations? What's the spillway going to be like? How are they going to have flood rainfalls when the next hurricane blows up through Louisiana, going to get rid of the water? I see Troy Todd, Patrick Smith, good to see him. Ryan Triple and Brian Lawrence, good to see you guys. So she's got a lot of things to figure out. So the process goes like this. First of all, where's the dam site going to be? Is it the best site? Is it the right size for that watershed, which means we measure the watershed? And Jacob's got a good question. Jacob West is asking, do you know if the fracking will change the water quality much? It won't change it at all. All it will do is consume water. So whatever the water quality is as it comes into the lake, it's not going to change the quality of the water at all. They're just going to use it. Ron says, I missed your call. I tried to ring him. Caught 5 bass in your cast net. That's good. Attaboy. All over standard weights. Well, I guess that means that you're not as good a fisherman as you need to be. Ron told me the other day, he was at the Institute of Higher Pondology, that he got bluegill out the wazoo and can't catch any bass. And he's wondering if the bass are there. Well, if you can catch 5 bass over 2.5 pounds, then that's pretty darn good in a cast net. So, job one is to design the dam properly. Can you drive a vehicle across the top of it? What are the slopes going to be? Have they calculated that? Is it going to be 2-to-1 slopes they're going to slough? You know, and so part of that negotiation is they build a dam according to the standards that you expect a dam to be built. And those standards are in writing. For those of you that are thinking about building a lake, I'm going to give you 2 pieces of advice right here. First of all, buy Mike Otto's book. Do you have a copy of that thing? Well, I don't have one right here. It's called Just Add Water. And then there's a handbook out there. This handbook 590, I think it's called Planning and Building of Ponds and Lakes, something like that. But it's handbook USDA handbook number 590. That is a good resource. It gives you some of the technical aspects of building ponds and lakes and what goes into building a dam. Then I told her, since your goals are different than their goals, we're going to be able to have to communicate those goals to them and then have them do the things that need to be done so that you end up with a lake like you want. You know, at Lusk Lodge Comatoo, that's for sale, by the way, the new Pond Boss has got an advertisement in there for it. So Debbie and I decided a few weeks ago that we were going to put our place on the market and see if we could sell it. So anyway, it's in here somewhere. But there's an ad in here. But where I'm going is that we got 11 acres of land, and we've got 8 ponds on those 12 acres. I don't like to mow that much. But each pond serves a different purpose. The one right beside the house is a swimming pond. The one above it is an older pond that we've used to help Purina Mills develop their feeds over the years, where we do food trials with different species of fish. Anything from hybrid stripers to feed-trained largemouth bass. I've got 2 hatchery ponds where I grow fish that I sell, to stock in brand new lakes and ponds. I've got a small experimental pond that every 3 or 4 years I would drain it, clean it out, rearrange the habitat in the bottom of it. It's maybe 1/10 of an acre. Fill it back up and then stock it and see how that habitat influences the fishery for the next 2 or 3 years. Then we've got a catfish pond where kids of all ages that never have caught a fish can come catch their very first fish. So where I'm going is in today's world, we can design a pond or a lake pretty much based on the landowner goals. So I did visit with her and tell her, you really need to refine those goals and pin them down. And then when we get ready to start talking about the process of designing the interior of the lake, it's going to be goal-based and then what the site has to offer. So she's got some decisions to make. Decisions she's got to make are going to be based on what she can negotiate and pin down the criteria for. What's the criteria of the dam they propose to build compared to the criteria of a dam that should be built? What's the criteria of the lake basin compared to the lake basin that they want to build? Do they want to clean out all the timber in the bottom of the lake, or are they just going to build a dam and flood the timber? So all these things need to be thought about and negotiated, and I'm going to help them come up with those lists of questions and probably even negotiate with that oil field company too. They're 6 or 8 months away from wanting to start clearing the site and think about building that dam. So it struck me that conversation today was a very fruitful conversation and a good forethought on her part to at least go seek some advice from somebody that knows a little bit more about it than she does. So let's see here. Let's see some questions here. Chuck Brinkman, I see Jerry Siebert checking in from Oregon. So would it be a good idea to require the oil company to supply and install habitat at different depths to create a somewhat consistent fishery as water levels change? That's something we will absolutely talk about. Since we know that the water levels are going to fluctuate as they use the water, then, and we know how big the watershed is, we can get some reasonable estimate of how much water that we can expect to come into that lake, and then based on the oil company oil field usage, we can expect and we can extrapolate how much the lake is likely to drop due to usage and due to evaporation. So designing the interior of the lake is going to be influenced by the timeline that the company is going to have about the water they're going to use. If it's going to be a 10-year contract, then we're going to look at habitat a totally different way than if it's a 1-year contract. And then the watershed size is huge because the size of the watershed, to give you an idea, along the Texas-Louisiana border, about 6 to 8 acres of watershed is enough to support 1 acre of pond. So with a 35-acre lake, I'm going to say 300 acres of watershed would be about what they'd want to support that lake. Now, that doesn't mean the lake won't fluctuate on its own. It certainly will, because when droughts and floods come, the lake level is going to fluctuate. So if the rain ends in June and doesn't rain again until the end of September, that lake could drop upwards of half an inch a day on the hottest, driest days. So we'll compensate for that. And the habitat that we will design will be based on the lay of the site, what nature offers. She said there's 2 creeks that come into the site where they want to build the dam, so that tells me that lake is probably going to end up being shaped like a molar, with the roots coming off of it. So we will take that into consideration. But to answer Chuck's question, absolutely, that will make a difference on how we design habitat. I'm working on a lake right now out in West Texas with a landowner out there where that lake level fluctuates 6 to 8 feet every year, and it's 35 feet deep at the deepest. And so we're designing that lake where we have a 3-to-1 slope down to a ledge that's about 15 feet wide, then another 3-to-1 slope going down to about 8 feet deep, and then a ledge to where when that lake evaporates down, they don't lose a whole lot of surface area. As it is now, it's about a 25-acre lake. When it drops down 3 feet, it's an 8-acre lake. So if we can stair step it and get some depth up in those shallow coves, then we can, and I'm going off on a little tangent, but it's appropriate to this discussion. If we can do that, then we can minimize the effect of the fluctuation, because we can have the lake stair step down where it goes to there, then to there, and then on down, however far it's going to go. So designing the inside of that lake is going to be impacted by how much water that the oil field company thinks they're going to use. When they were talking about building this 80-acre lake, they were talking about not drawing it down more than a foot at a time. What's 80 acre feet? So what that means in a 35-acre lake, they'll be dropping it 2.5 feet at a time. If that's the case, then we need to know, and we need to know what the depth is going to be. Because if about half the volume of any given lake is the top 3 feet of water. Check the math on that. The top 3 feet of water typically is the same volume as the rest of the lake. So if they pump 3 feet of water off of a 35-acre lake, that's half the water gone. So we'd be talking about that. Dave Weber says, since we're talking pond building tonight, when constructing one, do you advocate evacuating excess water from the surface or an overflow tube that draws from the bottom of the structure? In a perfect world, Dave, I would much rather have water exiting from the bottom of the lake. Now the main reason for that is when the water stratifies in the summer, the water below the thermocline, and I've talked about the thermocline many, many times on this show, but the water below the thermocline becomes anoxic, which means it becomes toxic to living creatures because there's no oxygen in it. So when a rainfall comes in, plus, a lot of us, especially in the South, we're trying to manage the upper reaches of the water column to be productive, which means we're feeding the fish. In some areas of the country, we'll be fertilizing the lake. And more than likely, this lake would be fertilized, because if they're pumping water out of it, I'm going to recommend that they pump it off the bottom. And then we fertilize the top, keep all that good fertility in the top layer. So therefore, when we do get a rainfall, having the water exit the bottom of the lake, which might just mean a siphon tube, a 12-inch siphon tube coming from the bottom, 3 or 4 feet off the bottom, coming up the dam, going over and going out, where it can suck that anoxic water off. I know that's kind of confusing to some folks, because how does it get the bottom water off? Well, that's where the intake is. So when the intake's on the bottom, it can suck that bottom water out and release it on the backside back into the creek, and dump it over a bunch of rocks and let it aerate as it goes on down the creek. So the answer to that question is yes, I would. Now, depending on the watershed size, I do think a primary spillway is real important. The primary spillway is that overflow pipe. I also think you need a secondary or an emergency spillway, and in some cases you need a third spillway, which means a spillway at each end of the dam. Essentially is what that means. So when you've got that 12-inch pipe, for example, which I don't know how big the pipe would need to be for this lake, because I don't know anything about the site yet, but I will in a couple of days. Then when you get that normal rainfall, the primary spillway, a normal rainfall in most areas is going to be, well, it varies from geographical region to geographical region, but a typical rainfall might be 3 inches. And a 35-acre lake might rise 5 inches from a 3-inch rain, or it might rise a foot. That primary spillway is adequate enough to take care of a normal runoff rainfall event. That's its job. So the diameter of the pipe is determined by the size of the watershed and calculating what that average runoff rainfall is on that site. So if it's pasture, if it's mountains, if it's agricultural property, if it's concrete, that helps us figure out how much runoff we're going to get from X amount of inches of rain. So there's a little bit of guessing that goes on with that. So to answer your question, yes, that overflow pipe should take it from the bottom, but it should also be the primary spillway to handle a normal rainfall event. Then the secondary spillway, often called the emergency spillway, is typically an earthen spillway, and depending on the slope of it going down back into the creek, you don't ever want the spillway to go around and hit the backside of the dam, so water moving over it doesn't churn up and chew up the backside slope of a dam. That the width of that spillway and the freeboard above your primary spillway, so how many vertical feet above that primary spillway, helps you determine how big that secondary emergency spillway should be based on a 100-year flood. You know, a 100-year flood in Las Vegas might be 4 inches, where that's a normal rain in Montgomery, Alabama. You know, a 500-year flood where I live is, I mean, a 100-year flood where I live is probably 9 inches in 12 to 16 hours. That's a 100-year flood. So that emergency spillway should be able to compensate for that. And then in cases where the watershed is quite a bit bigger than that dam site that's proposed is going to be, we'll go to the other end of the dam, come up another 2 or 3 feet of freeboard, and add another spillway. That way, if the emergency spillway is never flowing any deeper than about 18 inches, and we calculate those elevations to match that. So that third spillway sometimes is necessary. I've seen that necessary in several lakes. This may be one. I don't know. But I will know that before long. So I thought that's kind of a good topic. Jeff Thompson got a question here. He says, targeting to feed largemouth bass 18 to 21 inches long this winter with rainbow trout. What size would you purchase? His Fade has it. Look here. There's this little magazine called Pond Boss. $35 a year, by the way. Let me see here. Where is it here? Page 22 of the November-December issue of Pond Boss. Here it is right here. Winter trout in the deep south. So, the size trout, if you're going to be feeding 18-inch... Okay, hey guys, help me out here. How much should an 18-inch long largemouth bass weigh? Just somebody type that in. How much should it weigh? I'm going to scroll down through on my phone, make sure I'm not missing any people. Steven Stupa. Let's see here. Scott Schwing. Good to see some good names. Jamie Desjardins. And that's a French name, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm sure I butchered that. John Allen, good to see you. So I'm really glad to see all y'all. Dustin Crawley, I see you on here too. Glad you guys are here. All right, so did anybody type in? Okay, Doug Brown says 4 pounds. Kyle Edwards says 4.5. An 18-inch largemouth bass should weigh 3 pounds and 4 ounces. So a 3-pound, 4-ounce bass, Vito looked it up, 3.14. That's pretty damn close. That's real close. And Christopher, of course, the Cajun is going to figure out how to cook that 18-inch bass. I see that coming. All right, so it's Jason Rutledge. Good to see you. So an 18-inch bass should weigh 3.25 pounds. And so that, if you know the mouth gape size, which is going to be about like that, that's big enough to eat an 8-inch rainbow trout. So if you want to target, and the better news is a few 2-pound bass can eat an 8-inch rainbow trout, but I would target 8 to 9-inch rainbow trout to feed those bass that you're talking about. 18 to 21-inch bass, an 8 to 10-inch rainbow trout would be perfect to feed those bass. Now, depending on where you are, I've got a number of people where it's where they do buy rainbow trout to feed the bass. and as this article explains by Dr. Wes Neal in this issue of the magazine, it's real smart to choose the sizes. So you don't want to go buy a bunch of 4 to 6 inch rainbow trout and put them into a bass crowded lake, because then the 12 to 14 inch bass are going to tear them up. Now, here's the way it actually works. Now, if you want to buy some 6 to 8 inch rainbow trout after the water's gotten colder, like after Thanksgiving, that can be a good idea too, because you can feed those little trout and get them up into that 8 to 9 inch size by spring, where the bass are really going to honk down and eat them. They're going to really, really forage and gorge and eat as those trout begin to slow down in the spring. But here's a direct answer to that question. 8 to 9 inch rainbow trout fit down the gullet of 18 to 21 inch largemouth bass. If you're going to buy a rainbow trout to feed bass, target the size of bass you want to feed with the size of trout that you buy. And then expect most of those trout, when the water's cold, they have an advantage because they're not sluggish. They're 55-degree water down to probably 45-degree water. They're going to be moving fast, where bass are not going to be moving around as much. So there's your answer to that. Let's see here. Dion Myers, Matt Rail just delivered some really nice red hair and bluegill. I love that guy. Matt Rail is one of my favorite folks in the fisheries business. Just one of my favorite folks anyway. I do want to take a minute and thank Purina Mills for sponsoring this show, as well as Texas Hunter. Jacob West and his daddy just got through buying a deer blind. They make some cool deer blinds. If you get a minute, go to TexasHunterProducts.com and just see what all they've got. They got some cool stuff. We ordered that blind yesterday. It was shipped yesterday. They're going to have it Friday and setting it up, getting it ready to shoot out of over the weekend. That blind is pretty cool because it's got both rifle windows and bow windows in it. And they bought it with an 8-foot stand to get it way up off the ground. So they can either bow hunt or rifle hunt out of that same blind. So let's see here. And I do also want to thank David Schneiderman for sponsoring the show as well, Easy Docks. Okay, so down here somewhere, let's see. Jacob says, any updates on the prawns? How do they handle cold weather? They don't handle cold weather at all. I was down at Running River Ranch with my son. As a matter of fact, last week's broadcast was from Running River Ranch. When you were watching me, I waved at the grandkids as they went by, and I was on a high spot in my pickup. So from there, a cold front blew through, and it was heavy rains. The temperature plummeted about 40 degrees, and the water temperatures just skyrocketed downward. Well, when I got home, I got a couple of my buddies around here, and my son Cameron was in town from Alabama, and we went out to the hatchery pond out here behind me that's got some prawns in it, and we thought we'd kill two birds with one stone. See, just by chance, if those prawns were still alive, we needed to harvest them. So we seined them up and had a bunch of bluegill. We brought them all up, and every one of those prawns was dead. And the water temperature was in the upper 50s. The water temperature was like 59, 60 degrees, and they were dead. Now I'm sad about that because they were big. They'd have been perfect to boil this week. But nonetheless, I'm still excited about prawns. I think that they're going to have a purpose. I wish I'd have studied them a lot earlier in my career, but I'm happy to be doing it now. And I've seen some things I'm pretty excited about. The fact that they eat algae, the fact that they graze, the fact that they'll live in plants. I got a feeling that they'll graze. I don't think they can control plants. However, I'll tell you this, in the numbers that we stocked, there wasn't one piece of filamentous algae in either one of the ponds that we had the shrimp in, the prawns, but all the ponds adjacent to those, every one of those had algae in them. So I'm enthusiastically hoping that they played a role in keeping the algae down. And another thing that was pretty exciting to me is the fact that they were consuming algae. They were regenerating and reusing and recycling the nutrients and putting those back into the water column. And they walk along on the bottom, and that's how they feed. They're bottom feeders and grazers. That's what they do. Now, they eat fish food because, I'd feed them fish food, and I know they eat it because I could see it. As that fish food sank around the edges, you could see at night with a flashlight them up there nibbling on it. Their eyes glow in the dark. They don't glow in the dark, but when you shine them with a flashlight, you can see their eyes. I can see a walleye in northern waters. So they don't handle cold weather at all. They didn't like it. They didn't like it so much, they died. And now it's really interesting to see what's happening with the water color and the water changes, because I know they were influencing the bloom in both of those ponds. Now, one of those ponds is pretty turbid. Pond Boss President 2024. I kind of wondered how long we could stay off of the politics, but I want to circle back on talking about that lake that this lady's building, because I do see a few parallels. You've got this group of people over here that want to do it the cheapest, easiest way possible to get the most water for the least cost. Then over here, we've got the landowner that has a completely different interest. These landowners don't want to be subjected to an improperly built lake that isn't permitted properly, that the dam isn't safe, because they get to live with the liability. So this group is willing to come in and do what they do to get the best bang for the buck. This group of people, this family, wants to have the best opportunity for a lake that adds value to the property, that they can enjoy, they can raise some good fish, and that they can enjoy swimming and boating and recreationally. So we got two different parties of people here. So now what the family's job is to make sure and hold that other side accountable and negotiate with them to be sure that this lake is built right for the better of all. All meaning the landowner, who's going to end up ultimately footing the bill, because if this lake isn't built right, it takes away from the value of the property. Now, I think it's a great deal that this oil field company wants to pay for it. But if you end up with something that's boarded up and can't be used in the end game, what's the point in doing it? So it really does need to be done right and properly with the right standards and the right expectations met. So there's quite a bit on both sides of this aisle that needs to come together to make the lake great. And that's what I'm going to tell you about that. So I'm happy I get to be the pond boss that's going to be in the middle, leaning to the right to help the family do what they need to do. There's my political speech. Daniel Hendrick says, hey, Pond Boss, when adding structure, is it possible to have too much concrete with regards to water chemistry? You know, Dave Weber, I visited with Dave Weber many, many times. No, wait, it wasn't Dave Weber, but it's up in that neck of the woods. There was a guy up there that helped design a lake, and they used, it was not far from an interstate highway where they were redoing it, so they had access to a bunch of concrete. So they put the concrete in there. Now keep in mind that concrete is made, and road base may be limestone, but they also use hydrated lime. When hydrated lime hits water, it just jacks that pH up off the charts. Well, this particular lake, that happened, and the pH was up above 9 all the time. But the fish seemed to do well, and the concrete helped. Now, if you, like Daniel, where you are over in East Texas, as long as that concrete isn't too loaded with hydrated lime, if it's just got lime in it, like I would go to the University of Google and find out the contents of that concrete. Then I'm going to tell you, for the size lake, 4-acre lake, you have access to 4 dump truck loads of riprap. Do it. Don't even think about it. That won't make any difference. That's not going to impact for a 4-acre lake. 4 dump truck loads of concrete is not going to impact the water chemistry. And if it does, it's going to help. It's not going to be anything that's going to be bad. It's going to help buffer the pH in an area of Texas where the water is naturally tannic and acidic. Let's see here. Travis Paul Smith got his new Texas Hunter mag. So I guess that's a catalog from Texas Hunter. Drew Hay, great answers. Bob, drainage basin and storm events are crucial to sizing overflows and emergency spillways properly. Not done correctly can result in a catastrophic failure. And I've seen those. They're not a pretty sight. Catastrophic failures, typically, the ones I've seen, did not necessarily occur because the dam wasn't built right. It occurred because the landowner did something stupid, like put chain link fence across the spillway so his fish can't leave, and it gets clogged up with debris, breaches the dam, and the dam blows out. You know, or a reason where you're not paying attention to muskrats or nutria or burrowing animals digging into the dam and they weaken it, or let too many trees grow up and then cut them all down and let the root balls rot and compromise the structural integrity of that part of a dam. So that's exactly right. So that's part of the negotiations I'm going to help this family with. Frank James want to max out 4 to 7 inch. Rainbow trout in my 1/8 acre forage pond. Only keep and feed them there about 6 to 8 weeks. Want them up to 7 to 10 inches before stocking them in the main body of water. Considering it will be cold and I will be feeding, how many? It keeps scrolling down. How many can I keep in the forage pond? Willing to push it a bit, since if I lose them, it's not a big deal. I'll tell you what, in a 1/8 acre forage pond, I'm going to tell you, you could put 500 in there if you want to spend that much money. Now, here's what's going to happen. With the weather the way it's been, the water temperature is not likely to get in the upper end of the range until next spring. So you're probably safe with water temperature, but what you're not safe from are predators. If you start feeding those trout and you got any otters around there and they figure it out, they're going to be eating your fish. I was talking to a lady a couple days ago that had a catfish pond where they'd been feeding out catfish all year long, and they thought they had otters, but they weren't sure until she saw an otter, and I asked her to send me pictures. And if I get the pictures, I'll publish them in the magazine. But she said she had an otter, 2 otters playing in her lake. One of them swimming on its back with a dead catfish laying on its belly as it was swimming upside down. So Frank, your biggest issue is going to be cormorants and otters, predators. So be on the lookout for that. But buying 4 to 7 inch rainbow trout, you can get those pretty economically and feed them. They'll grow really fast. 6 or 8 weeks is not much to ask. Then you can start catching them and throwing them into the lake. You can either seine them or you can catch them on hook and line on whole corn and throw them in the lake. Trying to maximize forage from a largemouth bass, but 100 pounds of small rainbow in the main body of water, 50 pounds of larger catchable ones there too. I do think that's a good idea. Wyatt, we're heading down in a few weeks. They have a place outside of Abilene, Texas. They live in Denver. Wyatt is a firefighter there, and we appreciate his service, even though Colorado didn't vote right yesterday. I'm not talking about politics. I remember a few weeks when you talked about winter and fall prep. Anything we should look at doing, thinking of adding spawning beds for bluegill for spring and find out if it's hydrilla? Yeah, identify your plants. And they're if they haven't gone dormant yet, they're getting ready to go dormant. So identify your plants. Take some pictures, key them out. Go to aquaplant.tamu, I think it is. Look up Aquaplant online. They got a great website about aquatic plants. So identify your plants and know what you've got. Don't do anything about plants now. It's too late. If you wanted to treat them with a herbicide now, it won't work because they won't take it up. They've stopped growing, and you just be wasting your money. Spawning beds, I think any time is a good time to do that as long as the fish aren't spawning. So anytime between now and probably the end of February would be a great time to be adding spawning beds. Now where Wyatt is there in north central Texas, almost west Texas, that area, you're very likely to get some bluegill spawns when you get 4 or 5 bluebird days in February. Because if your bluegill are 2.5 inches long to 3 inches long, if they're big enough, that's big enough to spawn. They'll spawn when you get a handful of those warm days where the air temperature gets up in the 80s and the water temperature just bumps into the 60s for a few days. They'll have babies. Doug Brown, getting a truckload of threadfin shad this weekend. Feeding harvest trout bass during the winter. Will the shad spawn? Hold it. Now, what's going on here? Will the shad spawn before spring, or will I have to restock shad in the spring? Well, Doug, I'll give all of our viewers just some good ideas about what happens with threadfin shad. Threadfin shad can get to be 6.5 inches long on a rare occasion, 7 inches long. Their typical lifespan's 18 months to 2 years. Because their lifespan's so short, they reproduce often and in pretty big numbers. Not as many as gizzard shad, but gizzard shad spawn once. Threadfin shad die when the water temperature hits 42 degrees. So if your water hits 42 degrees, they're going to die. Now, they won't spawn between now and next spring because the water's chilly enough that they're not generating eggs. Now, if you get adult shad, which if you're buying them this time of year, they're probably 2.5 to 3 inches long. They need to grow a little bit more, so they're not likely going to spawn at all this fall, but they will spawn next spring. Now, when there's a pond that doesn't have an overpopulation of bass, it doesn't take but maybe 50 to 100 shad per acre to generate a population of threadfin shad. The problem comes in, there's two problems with threadfin shad other than water temperature getting too cool and they're being preyed upon heavily. The thing about threadfin shad is that you don't need that many in fertile water for them to be able to successfully establish themselves. The problem is getting them. Like this time of year, you're probably paying about $75 to $100 a thousand for them, and you're getting them from a fish farmer, and you have a minimum order to meet. That's one of the downsides. You in order to make it profitable for the fish farmer, they got to bring so many to generate so much revenue for the business. Which sometimes you need that many, sometimes you don't. If you've got a bass crowded lake, you can put in 10 times the recommended number and they all get eaten within 2 weeks. So threadfin shad do best in water that's fertile, that's warm, with some substrate to spawn on. Now they like to stick their eggs. They stick their eggs around the edges of a pond from 30 minutes before daylight till about 30 minutes after daylight, after sunup, for about an hour when they're spawning. And they'll move into the shallows and just run in big long lines. They'll deposit their eggs, preferably in grass if they have it. Stick them on rocks. They'll stick them on logs. Just whatever is there. They don't like spawning in mud. Their survival rates are much lower in dirt because eggs actually have to be able to breathe. So they have to have oxygenated water around them all the time in order to hatch right. And then now, of course, this time of year when the water gets cool, you're not going to have the same kind of a plankton bloom that you ordinarily would in the summertime. So they're filter feeders. They don't like cold weather. You're getting them in the fall, which means you're getting them at a pretty good price. But are you going to need to do it again next year? Depends on two things. One is how cold your water gets. And two, how many bass you have in there that are going to eat them. If you have at least 50 to 100 per acre survive the wintertime, that's enough to reestablish the population. And you're likely to see that. Let's see here. Okay, I'm trying to scroll here, boys. Okay, Jeff Wallen. When you stock fathead minnows, will catfish feed on them as well as bass? Yes, they will. Now, fathead minnows serve two purposes, and two purposes really two efficient purposes. One is you stock fatheads in a brand new pond to promote their growth and reproduction with bluegill and red ear sunfish before you stock bass, because their role is to help fill the lake up with small bait fish to promote the first 18 months of bass growth. After 18 months, they're going to be gone. The second role they have is to be a good natural food in a catfish-only pond. Now, catfish don't tend to wipe them out, but the answer to your question is yes, catfish will feed on fathead minnows. Let's see here. Kyle Edwards says, what's the easiest, best way to build spawning beds on an existing lake? I'll tell you one way is you find a flat spot 18 inches to 30 inches deep, and you can take bags of pea gravel or buckets of pea gravel in a boat, and then over the bow, pour those buckets into those shallow, flat areas. That's a good way to do it. Another way is when the pond is down, like what Wyatt's pond's probably low. Get out there in this time of year when his pond is down probably 2 or 3 feet, and go out where that water is going to flood back up in there and build some spawning beds on that dry ground. But another way, what I've seen before, and you got to have a little bit of help to do this, but you've seen those 4-foot diameter plastic kiddie swimming pools. I've seen guys take those, put them out in the lake, punch some holes in them so that they'll sink easier, and then fill those up with gravel right over an area that's flat. That's another way you can do it. I see Chris Chavetta checking in. Let's see what Chris has got. Going to stock some rainbow trout for the Property Owners Association, getting 10 to 12-inch fish. Want to put some weight on them before letting people harvest. What would you recommend for feeding rates, time per day? I would feed them 3 times a day with a feeder, with a Texas Hunter feeder, and I would feed them 10 to 12-inch. I'd feed them Aquamax 600. Purina Aquamax Sportfish 600. That's a high enough protein. It doesn't have nearly as much fat as the feed that trout typically eat. Most trout farmers feed Silver Cup feeds or Rangan or one of those like that. But there where you are, excuse me, guys. My throat's starting to bark at me a little bit. I would feed them 3 times a day. I would feed them what they'll consume in a minute or less. Now, if they're cleaning it up in 30 seconds, you can feed them more. You want them to clean it up in about a minute. Now, depending on how many you get, that's going to determine the feeding rate. So I would set the timer based on how many fish that you decide to stock. And then I think it's a wise idea after they've been in there about a week to show up at one of the feeding times, make it convenient to where you can be there, either an early morning feeding before you go to work or, one before it gets dark, where you can actually watch them eat and see how well they consume it. Then you can adjust your timer from that. Okay. Wyatt says, our permit came through yesterday for carp. I know it's hard to say without seeing it, but what would be a good starting point for stocking? 3 per acre. Typically what I tell people, 3 per acre, and depending on the size of the pond, it could be vegetated acre. So for a 2-acre pond, I'd stock 6 or 7, and that's where I'd start. Now, that's if you have a problem with that vegetation and you know it's the kind of a plant that grass carp will eat. There's weeds around the edge for about 10 feet. Pretty thick. Fish guy thought it was I don't know why my computer is doing this. Fish guy thought it was hydrilla too. Got to identify the plant for it. Yep, that's exactly right. Weeds around the edge for about 10 feet, pretty thick. Now, one thing you also got to decide, Wyatt, is what role do those plants play for the habitat? If that's the only nursery habitat that you've got and it's not hydrilla, identify the plant first. If it's hydrilla, it needs to go to heaven soon. Now, it's going to die out in the winter, but that doesn't mean it's going to go away because hydrilla's got some pretty good staying power. It'll just crank back up and be worse next year than it was this year. Probably cover over half the pond this time next year if you don't do anything about it, and it is hydrilla. But I wouldn't want to know. I know you sent me a picture, but you really need to key that out and see it. But I would start with a rate at about 3 per acre because once you stock it, you can't unstock it. Not easy to do that. Doug Brown, $1,500 a truckload for the threadfin shad. That's about normal. I think sticking with the bluegill shell crackers is your best bet for the cost. That's the best bet for the cost long term because that's the backbone of the food chain. Threadfin shad, the risk this time of year is they'll die in the winter. And you need to know what your typical lowest water temperature is going to be because all they need is 15 minutes at 42 degrees, they're dead. So if $1,500, some guys say, you know what, they'll spend $1,500 because that's what they'd spend on a weekend trip to Vegas or something. Feed my bass for $1,500. Some guys will say, I'm all in, I'll do that. So I think that's relative. $1,500 for a truckload. That's pretty typical of what a fish farm has to charge to get a load of threadfin shad. So the advice I'm going to give you is I would do that unless you're 100% convinced that the water temperatures are going to drop to 42 or cooler. If you're convinced of that, don't buy the shad. If you're not, if you're convinced that your odds are good, that your water temperature won't get that cold there, and if I remember, I think you're in Mississippi or southern Alabama. I have a hard time remembering where everybody is. I remember some of you, but not everybody. Okay, Chris, you better, let's see here. Wait a minute. Holy cow. I'm getting behind. Christopher Aguilar, keep procrastinating. Need to buy a water test kit. Water been muddy since looking since the storms. Yeah, I think I would do that. Either that or send some samples in. Let's see here. Mike McPherson, should we cut back on the feed during the colder months? And do we switch to sinking food until the top freezes? I'm in central Indiana. You know, you can switch to a sinking feed, but there's no guarantees that they're going to eat that any more than they eat the floating fish food. The difference is the sinking feed is going to stay right where it is until it dissolves, and they can come along and eat it whenever they're ready. You know, where the floating fish food gets saturated with water and ultimately sinks, and if you got much wind, it's going to blow up against the shore and sink there where it won't get eaten. But I'll tell you this. If they're slowing down on that floating food, they're probably not going to eat much sinking food either. And it depends on the fish you're feeding. Bluegill are notorious for not wanting to pick feed up off the bottom of a pond, especially if it's silty right there. If that feed goes and sinks into the muck, they're not going to pick it up and eat it. Now, catfish probably would because they're used to that kind of feeding method. Barry Gann, good to see Barry. Kyle Edwards, good to see you. Barry says, seeing tons of small bait fish, half inch to 1 inch long right now. Restructured this pond 9 years ago, never seen this many hatch this time of year. Usually we see them early summer. Why would I be seeing that many this time of year? There's two reasons you're going to be seeing those fish this time of year. First of all, you got really good survival rates of good numbers of fish. The second reason, you had better survival rates of the later spawns. So when you've got bluegills this time of year, that means that you're probably close to balance between the predators and the prey. And it's not so much that you're getting an additional spawn. It's more that you're getting additional survival from the spawns that you normally have. So that's what that's about. Who knew, right? Chris, you've had 100 per acre. 100 per acre of 10 to 12 inch rainbow trout. They're going to be about half a pound a piece, maybe. So it's 50 pounds. They'll eat 1.5 pounds of fish food a day. So set your Texas Hunter timer to go off for about 8 seconds, 3 times a day. And a 50-pound bag, they should consume starting off about, here's how I'm figuring this. It's going through my mind. I'll just tell you what I'm thinking. If you know how many pounds of fish that is, a 10 to 12 inch rainbow trout is either 4 per pound or 2 per pound. If they're 2 per pound, they're half a pound a piece. 100 fish are 50 pounds. They eat about 3% of their body weight every day. So 50 pounds of rainbow trout are going to eat 1.5 pounds of fish food every day. So if you can feed 0.5 pound of fish food 3 times a day, then you're going to be on track. You're going to want to bump that up as they grow because they're going to convert less. Listeners, when you're talking to your kids that don't like to do math, here's where it helps. They're going to convert that fish food at something around 1.5 to 1, probably better than that. So every 1.5 pounds of feed that you feed, you're going to get 1 pound of rainbow trout. So when you feed that 1.5 pounds of rainbow of fish food to that 50 pounds of rainbow trout, you're going to have 51 pounds of rainbow trout. Then the next day when you do it again, 1.5 pounds of fish food, you're going to have 52 pounds of rainbow trout. Then you're going to have 53. Then you're going to have soon you're going to have 60 pounds of trout. At that point, you need to be feeding them about 2 pounds a day. So as they're growing, you're going to increase their feed and watch them. That's why I tell people, watch and see how long it takes them to clean up that fish food. If they're eating it between 30 seconds and a minute, that's about right. Now, with 100 per acre and you're feeding them 3 times a day and they're cleaning that up and you watch them a couple of times and you see, well, gosh, it's taking them about 30 seconds to eat all of it. You come back in a week, it'll take them 5 seconds to eat all of it. That's when you bump the feed up. If you really want to produce some trout. Now, you know, somebody's going to ask me the question, how much is too much? Well, too much is more than what the water can process the waste of. So if you get 100 pounds of rainbow trout, you're feeding them 3 pounds of feed a day. You know, so once those fish grow from 0.5 pound to 1 pound, 3 pounds per day, in that size pond, you could probably get away with feeding 6 or 7 pounds of fish food per day if you want to. Now, you don't have to feed that much. You're just not going to get the weight gains that you would by feeding more fish food. So there you go. Harrison Davis, in a 2-acre pond in Atlanta, Georgia, does it do the pond any good to leave the strong fountain running all winter long? Or could leaving the fountain mess up the fish's warmer water in the thermocline? Well, in the winter months, the thermocline, in the fall, by now the thermocline's gone. Now, you're not really going to get a thermocline. You will get thermal refuge though, because as you guys know, I've explained it quite a few times, is water just most dense at 39 degrees. So the bottom of a pond near Atlanta, Georgia, may be 40 degrees part of the winter. And if you've got a fountain sucking water from 18 to 24 inches down, it's not going to disrupt that thermal refuge. Now, what will disrupt that thermal refuge is when you get a hard cold snap where the wind is blowing hard and it churns the water up and sends that cooler water down and invades that thermal refuge. But the fountain's probably not going to play a role in that. In Valdosta, Georgia. Oh, yeah, okay, I remember now, Doug. Valdosta. Yeah, you stand a pretty good chance of those thread fins making it through the winter there. I would be asking my supplier, I don't know who you're buying them from, but ask them what their experience has been with survival rates of threadfin shad in that part of the country. All right, let's see here. We got Christopher Aguilar, Doug Brown. Gotcha. Okay. Hey, guys, holy cow, it's already 7:32. I'm going to wrap it up right there. And once again, thank you guys for tuning in. Remember, Texas Hunter, Purina Mills, Easy Docks. Thank them. Go to their websites to see the products they've got. They've got some cool stuff on all 3 of those websites. And if you have questions about this pond stuff, send them to me. Not sure where I'll be next Wednesday, but wherever it is, I'm probably going to be hanging out with you. I look forward to it. It stimulates me, and I hope it helps you. And until next Wednesday, adios.